Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Secret Life of the City: How Nature Thrives in the Urban Wild by Hanna Hagen Bjørgaas, translated by Matt Bagley, narrated by Helen Gallucci. Introduction: An Old Acquaintance. It began with a yellow-orange spot. I was standing opposite the penguin colony, on a rocky outcrop jutting up from the snow a few hundred yards above the shore. I looked a bit like a penguin myself. The multiple layers of clothing under my thick down jacket made my arms stick straight out from my body. That summer, I was working as a guide for Antarctic cruise passengers, and my job that day was to make sure the tourists didn't stray from the designated paths, and to answer any penguin-related questions. A gray-haired lady, wearing one of the cruise operator's red jackets, soon made a beeline for me. As she made her way across the snowfield, she paused to allow a couple of lively penguins to run past on their way to the sea, then caught her breath while she watched them dive in. When she reached the place where I was standing at the top of the hill, she said, in English but with a German accent, that she wanted to show me a photo she had just taken. I raised my sunglasses from my face while shielding my eyes from the glare of the sun. The photo she showed me didn't have any penguins in it. It was a close-up of some round, orange-colored shapes. It looked like a collection of glazed bowls, set on a yellow-orange carpet of solidified lava. "Isn't it beautiful? I saw it right down there," she said, pointing toward the penguin colony. "What is it?" Although they were quite a way off, I could see that the stones she was pointing at had an orange tint to them. In fact, the whole area around the penguin colony looked faintly orange. I looked at the photo again. Something about it was strangely familiar. Then I realized that what she had photographed was a lichen belonging to the Xanthoria genus. I had seen this yellow-orange lichen many times before in more familiar surroundings, on trees, rocks, and concrete, and I was sure I could remember something similar growing on a tree in my own backyard. Now the two of us stood marveling at the lichen's impressive structure, as though we were looking at it for the first time. It was beautiful. And that's how my story about urban nature began one glorious summer day in December 2017, in as unlikely a location as Deception Island, just off the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula. The island, essentially a crescent-shaped mountain range with a lagoon at its center, is so named because it is, in fact, the peak of an ancient volcano. A narrow gap between the mountains allows ships to sail into the extinct volcano's crater, which is now filled with icy Antarctic seawater. The lagoon has been the setting of two of humanity's most determined attempts to wipe out parts of the planet's wildlife. At first, the island was a base for hunting fur seals, then whales, in an era that almost destroyed the populations of both. Today, cruise ships, not fishing boats, keep the island's beaches occupied with people. On the beach that day were two enormous seals, drowsily waving their flippers in the air. The tourists stood in a semicircle around them and took photos. Where I was standing, a few hundred yards up from the beach, hundreds of chinstrap penguins huddled in their nests among the black volcanic rocks. The snowfield that sloped down from the colony to the sea was like a penguin motorway. From my vantage point beside it, I could watch them slide on their bellies to the edge of the steep snowfield and jump clumsily into the sea, where they became elegant underwater torpedoes. The tourists visiting the island that December day had paid through the nose to see penguins, seals, and spectacular views. And they got their money's worth. cold, nutrient-rich water from lower latitudes, pushed south by ocean currents in layers far below the surface, is forced toward the surface when it meets the Antarctic continental shelf. The seawater in this region is so rich in nutrients that huge blooms of algae can form when spring and light come to Antarctica. And the enormous number of calories in that algae provides sustenance all the way up the food chain, from minute zooplankton to seals, whales, and seabirds. A few hundred yards from shore was the gigantic cruise ship we were living on. It looked like a Lego boat when set against the vast and magnificent scenery which, on our voyage south, had offered us one spectacular view after the next. Here on the rocky outcrop by the penguin colony, the German lady and I looked out over a large glacier. At random intervals, the glacier would calve, sending pillars of ice crashing down into the ocean. Large and small icebergs floated in the water like sequins scattered on a dark velvet sheet, and each new icefall caused the sequin carpet to dance upon the waves. The falling ice blocks looked small from where we were standing, but our view was misleading. I knew those blocks could be as big as houses or apartment buildings, and when they separated from the glacier, they created waves large enough to capsize the many small tourist boats chugging noisily around the icebergs. It is normal for the ice to calve during the summer, but the sight of those icebergs in the water was a reminder that most glaciers on the Antarctic Peninsula are melting faster than usual. I thought about how our carbon dioxide emissions were contributing to this faster rate of warming. Most of us on the ship had also flown vast distances to get to Antarctica, and for every hour we sailed at cruising speed, our ship burned over 265 gallons of diesel. The idea of the landscape before us being untouched by humans was an illusion. 25 years ago, Deception Island had perhaps twice as many penguins as it does today. And one of the reasons for this decline is climate change. We guides had been told by the tour operator that this strange and beautiful landscape would touch the people seeing it, that these voyages create ambassadors for nature. We were told that standing beside a massive glacier with near luminous blue ice gleaming deep within its cracks, and visiting penguin colonies that have been stable for tens of thousands of years, would stir something within us. The idea was that these experiences would make it more important for the tourists, for us all, to make good environmental decisions back home. Our job as guides was to make sure the tourists had memorable encounters with nature, that nature made an impact on them. It should have been easy. But something wasn't right. Although some of these people were fulfilling a lifelong dream, others seemed quite indifferent to what they were seeing. They came, took their photos, wandered around a bit, and left. I felt like I understood why. These trips ashore were subject to strict rules and regulations. No one was allowed to walk around and explore and discover things on their own. To ensure efficiency and safety in this alien landscape, the excursions had to involve as little unpredictability as possible. The list of what tourists could see was specific and came with a price tag. It was an Antarctic adventure with a carefully edited script. On the other hand, there was no lack of beauty. The tour operators are selling the status that comes from posting a photo of Antarctic glaciers on Facebook or Instagram. Instead of whale blubber and sealskin, what's being consumed now is beautiful scenery. I came to realize that I found the herds of tourists wearing borrowed red jackets and ill-fitting hiking boots, all of them attempting to take selfies with the penguins without getting other tourists in the shot, slightly ridiculous. It was hard to admit, but it was true. what about me? I, too, had been travel bragging on social media to overwhelming numbers of likes. But my degree in biology didn't render my trip more valuable or less harmful to the vulnerable Antarctic environment. I had also been lured there by the desire to see things that few others have seen. Standing there with the Antarctic glaciers and penguins before me, and with an iPhone photo of an orange lichen in my hand, it dawned on me that I knew more about Antarctica's lichens than I did about the lichens in my own backyard. It was food for thought. I have spent significantly more time in the city than in the wilderness beyond it. It's where I've always lived. I grew up in Trondheim, a medium-sized city in the middle of Norway, in a residential area near the center. Several coincidences, along with a vague interest in nature, had led me in the direction of biology and botanical studies. But I hadn't found those studies particularly easy. Remembering the Latin names did not come naturally, as it clearly did for some of my fellow students who were hobby biologists while growing up. I felt overwhelmed by the hundreds of species that make up an ecosystem, and they all seemed alike. What saved me during my student years was the realization that I could fall in love with the details. To train my eye on a particular thread in the tangled web of different species felt great. It was like learning a craft. But I felt something else in addition to the sense of mastery. The process of scrutinizing plant names with a loupe, searching for ligules or forked stem hairs, hidden details that distinguished this particular plant from other species, brought me a sense of peace I had never experienced before. Perhaps driven by some latent passion for collecting, I could walk around for days in the woods, in the mountains, or by the shore, trying to find out what was living there. Recognizing a species I had seen before was like meeting an old friend. The world of biology opened the door to field courses, excursions, and jobs. Eventually, biology also took me to a couple of the world's most pristine natural areas, which I explored, binoculars and loupe at the ready, while looking, learning, and understanding. But when each trip ended, I took off my binoculars and loupe, packed them in my rucksack, and went home to the city, which was now Oslo, to the orange lichens and crows and dandelions. By the time I returned from Antarctica, it was January. All the snow had melted and the city looked drab. My adventure was over, and there were no more trips on the horizon. Far from it, in fact. For various reasons, I was going to have to stay in the city for some time. And that bothered me. City life is okay when I'm feeling good. But when things aren't going so well, I often find that it helps to be in the forest or the mountains, where no more is demanded of me than my presence. And when things get really bad, all I want to do is stroll around without distraction or purpose in places where there are trees and birds and lichens to look at. And in the vacuum of returning from a long trip, the restlessness stirring inside me was telling me I needed to get out of town. But as things were, I had to make do with staying put in a cramped apartment overlooking one of Oslo's busiest roads. On my first day back in Oslo, I had no plans other than getting over the jet lag. I walked around the streets, trying to unwind. The pigeons outside the subway station were pecking away at what looked like a squashed pastry. Swarms of sparrows chirped noisily from the ornamental bushes. Everything around me seemed to be shaped by humans. The wonderfully complex nature I had just returned from had been reduced to this: sparrows, pigeons, hard surfaces, and right angles. A destitute landscape. I turned and walked home. When I arrived back at my apartment, I noticed something. Next to the bike rack in the backyard stood a mountain ash, from which, just a day earlier, I'd hung a couple of suet balls for the birds. But all that remained of the suet balls were the green plastic nets, now dangling mournfully from their respective cotton strings. January. The Urbanite's Reflection. It took a robbery for me to understand the potential in those black crow eyes. The suet balls hanging from the tree in the backyard were the stolen items, but until then, the small, acrobatic blue tits had had a virtual monopoly over them. The sparrows stayed right where they were in the bushes. The magpies had a go, but since they're not built for hanging upside down, they flew off in shame after a few bungled attempts. The day after I hung up the suet balls, they were gone. All that remained were the 2 green nets wafting in the breeze, and there wasn't a blue tit in sight. Slightly puzzled, I went back into my apartment, fetched a pair of scissors and 2 new suet balls, and went back out to the tree. The mesh bags had been torn open, as though they had been slashed with a knife. No blue tit could have done that. I hung up the new food balls and kept an eye on the tree through the kitchen window. The next morning, I saw a crow sitting on the branch the suet balls were hanging from. I hid behind the kitchen curtain to avoid being seen. The bird cocked its head toward the ball dangling a few inches below. Then it bent down, grabbed the string with its beak, and hoisted the suet ball up a bit. The crow teetered for a few seconds with the ball still dangling well below the branch. Then it fumbled about trying to step on the white cotton string before finally holding the string down with its foot. The bird then opened its beak and shook its head to free itself from the dry cotton string. The suet ball was a couple of inches closer to the bird. The crow teetered a bit more, struggling with the heavy load before once again stepping on the rope and letting go with its beak. The ball was now just below the branch. Next, the bird bent down carefully, gripped the top of the net, and with a jerk of its head pulled up the suet ball like an angler flipping their catch into a boat. The momentum caused the crow to stumble backward, but with a few thrashing wing strokes, it righted itself. And there it stood, with my suet ball safely in its care. It struck me that if I ever had to pull a rope with just one arm, that's exactly how I would do it. If you have ever watched a crow picking apart a garbage bag, you won't need me to explain how quickly this crow tore a hole in the mesh around the suet, which, once released from the net, promptly fell to the ground. And as I watched the crow fly away, heavily laden, I thought about how determined it had been. Nothing about what the crow had done seemed random. It had a plan. Had it learned the trick from someone, or come up with this solution on its own? At the time, I had quite an aversion to crows. I'd once seen them snatching baby eider ducks that were bobbing about in a row in the sea like little balls of wool. The mother duck was at the front of the line and had no chance of saving her ducklings from the crows. I also found it almost perverse how well these wild animals had adapted to living off our garbage. I saw crows as unwanted, unworthy city dwellers, unlike other, more likable city birds, such as the aforementioned blue tits. If I went out with a bag of stale bread to feed the ducks by the river, I would try to throw the food toward the ducks specifically so that the crows didn't get it. But watching the crow solve the problem with the suet ball had been fascinating. I had seen plenty of crows in my life, but they always seemed to be operating in my peripheral vision. Had I really seen one? What did it look like? I sat down at the kitchen table and tried to draw the crow I had been spying on. But I just couldn't come up with a good picture. My pencil scrawled a dark and shapeless creature. The only recognizable feature was its beak, a sharp, scythe-like weapon. It vaguely reminded me of Pesta, the hunched and hooded woman who personified the Black Death in the drawings of Norwegian artist Theodor Kittelsen. But it was while watching the crow haul up the suet ball, one beak length at a time, that I had noticed a certain glint in its eyes. There was something about this creature that intrigued me. January turned out to be a good time for surveying crows. When fall comes and darkness looms over the afternoons, crows begin to cluster, leaving their territories, dissolving their relationships, and becoming part of a large flock. These winter flocks can be enormous. One of these flocks ruled the palace gardens in Oslo, where I went one afternoon. A fresh snowfall earlier that day had covered the old, compacted snow like a blanket of cotton wool. It was a totally calm day. The trees looked like black pillars against the pale blue sky. The wide slopes leading up to the palace, which normally bustled with tourists in the summer, were almost empty. But there were a few people here and there, walking or cycling purposefully through the park. The crows also looked like they had something important to do that day. They hopped around in the snow or fluttered between the branches. One bird landed in a large birch tree, its weight sending fresh snow cascading silently to the ground. I sat down on a bench a few feet away and took out my binoculars. I had discovered that spying on crows was quite hard, but not because of any technical difficulty. It was the opposite. Crows were everywhere when I first started noticing them, and they came so close. There was almost no point in having binoculars. The problem was me. I was so used to walking past them that it required a huge effort to actually stop. Even having decided to look at the birds, my first impulse was to go and spy on the people walking along Oslo's main street, Karl Johans Gate, or check my phone for email instead. But I had decided to spend half an hour watching crows, and so I pointed my binoculars up at the birch tree. A crow squinted back at me and gave me a few moments to study it. Its furrowed brow sat low over its eyes, and its wide beak gave the impression of a broad gape, with downcast corners not entirely unlike an elderly Mick Jagger's mouth. The crow didn't seem to like being looked at. It became quite vigilant when I raised my binoculars, as if it knew I was getting right up close to it, if only with my eyes. The crow's large head was bent forward, an extension of its powerful neck. It seemed front-heavy. Its head, chest, and wings were all covered in black feathers that were curiously both matte and shiny. The rest of its body was covered in a matte, slate-gray plumage. Up close, I could see that these feathers went all the way up to the underside of its beak, giving it a kind of downy chin. The crow stared right at me. Admittedly, a crow's pupils, irises, and the feathers around its eyes are totally black, like a person wearing dark sunglasses, so it was hard to say exactly where it was looking. It was quiet in the park. The roar of traffic around the nearby National Theater had been reduced to a faraway hum, deadened by the snow. Now and then the silence was interrupted by a couple of muffled crow calls. Caw, caw, which sounded like parts of the bird's daily conversation. A group of pigeons pecked around in the snow beside a garbage bin. A cyclist exhaling foggy breaths rode up the wide slope in front of the palace, the snow creaking under her tires. She rode past the pigeons, then turned onto a trail and vanished among the trees. A young man wearing a suit and overcoat had come up the hill and was walking toward the larch tree where the crow was sitting. He was holding something wrapped in white paper with the word Subway written across it. His dress shoes looked unsuitable for the snow. The crow in the tree nodded its head. It blinked under its black hood. The man then slipped on the icy path, and with his arms flailing, let go of what was in his hand. When he regained his balance, he paused for a second and continued walking, leaving the half-eaten sandwich he had dropped lying in the snow. The crow immediately lost interest in me. As soon as the man was out of sight, the bird flew down from the tree and landed on the ground beside the man's abandoned lunch. It pecked at the sandwich from different angles, then tried to pick it up with its beak, but the two halves of the bread just fell apart, exposing the filling inside. The crow then looked around, picked up the half with cheese and ham stuck to it, and quickly bounded off toward some nearby bushes. The bird struggled through the stiff branches until it reached the middle of the bush and left the bread by the roots. Then, using its beak as a shovel, it buried the sandwich in the snow. The crow reversed out of the bush, looked around again as if checking to make sure no one had seen what had happened, and quickly went back for the other half of the sandwich. It then picked up the remaining food in its beak and, with its heavy load, flew away. The Crow Watcher. "I've been awake since 5 o'clock, said Geir Sonnerud, his face stretching as he yawned. He spoke in a calm East Norwegian dialect that made me wish I was making a radio show instead of writing a book. It used to be bird watching that dragged me out of bed. Now it's my age." There we sat, cups of tea in hand, at the researcher's kitchen table at his home in West Oslo. He looked in surprisingly good shape for someone almost 70 years old. Other than waking him up early, age didn't seem to have affected Geir to any noticeable degree. It wasn't clear if the spring in his step as he strode across the living room was due to the antioxidants in the green tea or the bowl of nuts and dark chocolates on the table. I ate quite a lot of the chocolate anyway, just to be sure. Geir is a biologist and a professional crow watcher. He told me that when he began studying biology, urban nature was not considered nature among his contemporaries. Nature was something that went on beyond the city limits, and only the most pristine nature was considered worth studying. In keeping with the spirit of the times, it wasn't really crows, but the elegant birds of prey that caught his attention when he was a young boy. "I'm really embarrassed about how blind I was to urban nature," he laughed. I had told Geir about my experience in the palace gardens and the incident with the suet ball. Both stories had made him wildly excited. He told me that he and his colleagues had set up an experiment, which was actually aimed at northern goshawks. They had placed 3 brown chicken eggs in a fake nest in a small area of woodland. Geir had then sat quietly on the outskirts of the woods, camouflaged and equipped with a telescope. But the goshawks didn't show up, and Geir started getting bored. Until something else captured his attention. A crow had found the nest containing the eggs. Crows love eggs. 3 chicken eggs are too much for one crow to eat at once. So what would it do with the eggs it couldn't eat right away? In fact, the crow didn't waste time eating any of the eggs. It looked around. Then it picked up one of the eggs in its beak and hurried off to a nearby spot where it put the egg on the ground and hastily covered it with moss and lichen. The crow rushed back to the nest and picked up another egg, and this time it flew a little bit farther away. With 2 of the eggs properly hidden, the crow had plenty of time to consume the 3rd and last egg at its leisure. "The crow won't waste time eating the first egg. It'll make sure it gets as many eggs to safety as possible," said Geir. He explained that this crow had hidden the eggs based on stringent mathematical logic. Every second counts for the crow, which is surrounded by rivals on the food front. It must find the best compromise between protecting the rest of the eggs in the nest and hiding each egg well enough. while the first egg is being hidden.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?